To expose Lambda functions outside, you generally use like an AWS API Gateway, but then you have to pay request, and it can be quite expensive if you have a lot of traffic going through this API Gateway. So we have a way to expose these Lambda functions directly through our gateway and bypassing the AWS API Gateway. If you use EKS, you don't really need to do what I'm going to do now, which is like deploying this Amazon pod identity webhook. But here I'm using like kind cluster, so I need to add this component and cert manager and so on, so that I can allow some of my pods to talk to these Lambda functions, and basically you will see I'll explain which components needs to be able to reach out to this Lambda function and talk to the Kubernetes, no, the AWS API, sorry. So I'm deploying these different components here. So cert manager and then this Amazon pod identity webhook. And now that I have done that, I can annotate the service account that is used by the Istio ingress gateway, so that the gateway is going to be able to send requests to some Lambda functions. So you do that, and the next step is creating something we call a cloud provider. So you can see here that will be like the platform team that will be responsible for doing that normally, creating a cloud provider in the management cluster and telling which account ID they want to expose to the application teams, which region, and also if they want to enable discovery. So you can create what we call cloud resources manually, so that you can define the functions that people are able to use, or you can just enable discovery, which is what we are doing right now. And if I enable the discovery, then what I need is that I need to allow the management server in the management cluster to also talk to the AWS API to get information about the available functions in Lambda. So I'm doing this here, and if I wait for a few seconds, I will start to see these cloud resources being created based on what has been discovered, right? So I can look at that, and I see here that automatically we find out that there are a few functions that are available that have been discovered through the AWS API. So now if I want to route some traffic to one of these Lambda functions, it becomes very easy. I can just, as a user, as an application owner, I can create like a route table and say if a traffic is sent to this /lambda prefix, then I want to not send the traffic to a pod in my cluster, but instead I want to forward this traffic to this Lambda function that's called workshop echo, and I don't want to do any transformation, right? So I just want to get the raw output from the Lambda function. So if I execute this command, and then if I do like a curl on this path here, I should just get this output here, that is basically the standard output, the raw output from the function. And you can see the Lambda function itself looks like that, right? So it's just like returning what it gets, right? And what's interesting is that you see here I have like a JSON payload with the headers and the HTTP method and the path and these kind of things. And generally what's happening is that you don't really want to return the raw payload from the functions. because what's happening is you normally get this whole payload, and the AWS API Gateway is using it to extract from the payload the header that needs to be returned to the end user on the body and so on, right? So there is some transformation that is done by the AWS API Gateway, and if you want to replace this AWS API Gateway, then you need to make sure that the same transformations are done by the platform gateway, right? So what we do in that case, and that's what we are going to show in the second example, we are going to use a Node.js Lambda function that return this response with this status code and these headers and some data like the body in the format that is expected by the AWS API Gateway, and we are going to update our route table to send the traffic to this function. But you see here we want to have the default response transformation, which basically means we want to transform the response the same way the AWS API Gateway is doing it. So that now if I send my request here, I can see that I just get this body, right, instead of getting the raw response, right? And you could also see if you look at this curl with the -i, with showing the headers, right? I can see this key equal value header, this x custom header with my value, my other value, which basically comes from this Node.js function that has returned these different data in this JSON payload, right? So we have extracted this data from the payload and transform it in the same way it is transformed by the AWS API Gateway. You can even apply some extra transformation and so on, but basically the idea here is to show that you can easily replace the AWS API Gateway by our gateway without having anything change for the end user.